Amen. Well, tonight I want to do sort of an overview, and then in there, what I want to do is build why there'd be a tabernacle and how that tabernacle plays out. But I want to start with an overview of God's economy, if you will. What is God doing? Where is God going? Because from the outside in, if all you look at is little pieces, you never really get the picture. You don't get the whole thing. And that's what I'd like to do. So I'm going to share my screen, and you're going to have to put up with my artwork. So what I'm assuming you're looking at this chart right now. And that's a chart of 8,000 years. So we start over here in Eden, and after 1,000 years, we're still before the flood. Between the fall and the flood, 1,656 years. And those are pretty easily counted because all the numbers are laid out in Genesis. But we have a fall, then we cross the 1,000-year barrier, then the flood, and Abraham's right at 2,000 years. Now, the Old Testament ends with Jesus Christ. Here's Jesus Christ in Pentecost, 4,000 years from Adam. And these are rough figures, because really, as far as we know with the creation of Adam, it's 3961, not exactly 4,000, but close enough that we can say 4,000 years before Christ. So basically what you've got then, here's your 4,000 years before Christ, 4,000, 3,000, 2,000, 1,000, and back to the fall, which means that if you're reading Genesis 11, Abraham shows up in Genesis 11, you started in Genesis chapter 1, you've now read 11 chapters, and you've now read half your Bible, because you've now read 2,000 years of the 4,000 years, basically 4,100, if you want to go all the way to the end of the life of the Apostle Paul. And people don't really realize that. They don't have a chronological perspective, and so they're not seeing kind of what's happening and how God at the beginning goes really fast. Like I say, he goes, 2,000 years in the first 11 verses, and then there's more verses to 1,000, and then things really slow down because you have all the prophetic books, the huge books of Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and so you get a lot more print between, say, David in this 1,000-year here. You get a lot more print. So we go from the fall to Abraham, 2,000, another 1,000 to get to David. And note this: we have David in the kingdom, and we have Kings and Chronicles, and the temple's burned, but the temple wasn't even built until Solomon, and that's somewhere around 980. And the temple's burned it's burned in 586. So the temple only existed for about 400 years. And then all of a sudden, then you have this jump from 586 to Christ. And then look at the size of the age of grace here. The age of grace is as long as it is from the fall of Adam to Abraham. The age of grace, God has really poured out his grace, really been invested in you and I for a very long time. So he's got this 2,000 years here for the age of grace. Then I don't know when the rapture is going to occur, but I'm going to say it's relatively soon. So after 6,000 years, here's the rapture. Then we have 1,000 years of Christ in his millennial kingdom. And then you have the devil loosed. You have the final war. The rapture and Armageddon come very close together within 7 years. Christ's millennial kingdom. You have the final war. The devil is destroyed. And then you have God's everlasting kingdom, which lasts forever. Now, interestingly enough, this green and this green is what God really wanted. So in the beginning, here's Eden. And what do you have? You have mankind perfectly healthy, ruling the earth, and God gets to show up in fellowship with them. Now, that may be new to some of you. If that's new to some of you, I want to point you to the REB commentary of Acts chapter 7, verse 55, because I don't have time to really develop that right now. But we can start in Genesis chapter 3. If we want to go ahead and start in Genesis chapter 3, because the world believes, no man has seen God at any time, and that's true. When God would take on human form, that wasn't all he was. And it was, obviously there's a lot more to God than just that. But the fact of the matter is, God himself would come in the form of a human being. And that's what he wanted. Why did he create human beings to begin with? He wanted to fellowship with us. He wanted to hang out with us. And that's what he did with Adam and Eve in the garden. And if we look at Genesis chapter 3, well, we know that Adam and Eve sinned, and so now they've sinned and they've fallen. But God's going to show up like he always does. So in verse 8, Genesis 3, they heard the sound of Yahweh God walking around in the garden. Now, I'm a hunter, and I know what it's like to sit in the woods in the fall of the year when there's leaves, and you hear things walking around. And this is God, and they hear the sound of Yahweh God walking around. Now, this was outside the 9 dots of the King James translators. They translated the Hebrew word kol as voice. They didn't hear a voice walking. They heard the sound of God walking, his footsteps, crunch, 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 because God would come down in the form of a human being. And he did that there at least 3 times in Abraham's life, where it tells us he did that. Jacob saw him as a human being. Isaac saw him as a human being. Samuel saw him as a human being. Solomon saw him. Isaiah saw him. Stephen saw him in Acts chapter 7, verse 55. John saw him in the book of Revelations, chapter 4 and 5. Like I say, there's a lot about this. And if you look at the commentary on Acts 7:55, then that'll explain and expound that to you, and you can check all those verses, read the logic of it. But the beauty of it is that it's what God wanted. When God created humankind, what he wanted people who loved him, that he could fellowship with. And he would, until the fall, he would come down in human form and hang out with Adam and Eve, just like he did in Genesis 18 with Abraham, when God came with 2 angels, and then God came to Abraham's tent and ate a meal there. He was fellowshipping. He was hanging out with Abraham, who's the only person in the Bible who's called a friend of God. So this green over here is what God wanted. He wanted to be able to personally come and hang out with people who loved him. But then you have the fall. So now what God has to do is he's going to take 7,000 years, and he's going to wheedle and tweedle in different ways to bring about this again. Now, one of the things we should know is when we talk about the Garden of Eden, and let's go to Genesis chapter, we're in Genesis chapter 3. Let's go back a chapter to Genesis chapter 2. And in Genesis chapter 2, in verse 8, Yahweh God planted a garden in the east in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. I think one of the mistakes that's been made in Bible translations is to transliterate the Hebrew, which basically is transliterated as Eden, E-D-E-N. It's not an exact match, but it's close enough. But they transliterated Eden instead of translating it. The word Eden means delight. It's a garden of delight. And interestingly enough, the Greek word in the Septuagint is paradisos. And of course, you can imagine what English word we get from paradisos. We get paradise. And so one of the things that you have when we're talking about here, the green back here, this green is paradise, and this green is paradise. So Adam and Eve lost paradise here when they fell, and God's going to mess around and go through various stages and things, and then he's going to get back to paradise. And when we look at the everlasting kingdom, when we go to Revelation chapter 21 and 22, and we look at the everlasting kingdom, what do we see? We see exactly what God had originally set up in Eden. God shows up as a human being. It says he will dry every tear from our eyes. He has a throne. We can all see him. He sits on the throne with the Lamb of God, his son, Jesus Christ. So he's in personal relationship with us, and everybody there loves God because all of the wicked, evil people are gone. So what God originally designed and wanted in Genesis before the fall, in Eden, in paradise, he's going to get finally, but he has to go through some machinations to get there. So going back to the chart for a second, here we go from the fall and we go to the flood. Mankind had become horribly wicked. God had to start over with mankind after the flood, and then God gets to Abraham. In this period here, in this 2,000 years between the fall and Abraham, God dealt with anybody who would worship him anywhere they were. And God was happy dealing with that. Later on, he's going to bring that into more focus. We can see that, of course, in the everlasting kingdom, because God and Christ have a throne. You're going to worship God, of course, you're going to go where he is. Starting with Abraham now, what God's going to do is, instead of all the people on earth, God's going to work with one family. And so in Genesis chapter 11, we see Abraham. In Genesis chapter 12, God is calling Abraham, and he's going to work with Abraham. So let's go to Genesis chapter 12. And you know what else I want to take you back to Genesis 2 just a second, because I missed something here that I wanted to speak about just a second. In Genesis 2:15, while we're learning about the Garden of Eden, God was gracious to Adam and Eve in the sense that he didn't give them such huge responsibility that they couldn't do it. It says in verse 15, Yahweh God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden, the garden of delight, put him into paradise to work it and to take care of it. Now, when we think about the amount of work that a person would want to do to have a leisurely life, I mean, you don't want to work like a dog every day of your life. If God is loving us and he's going to give us something meaningful to do, but it's not something that's burdensome. It's something that's a pleasure. It's something that's meaningful. And he says, okay, I'm putting you in my paradise garden and you're going to work it and take care of it. Now, how big do you want to make that? It's actually going to be fairly small. The Garden of Eden would not have normally been more than a few acres, because he's going to work it to cultivate the plants and stuff, and he's going to take care of it. Now, if they stayed faithful to God and had children and everybody was obeying God, then you'd have a situation where, of course, people would plant more and more and more, take over more and more land, and eventually the ground would be much more covered with people and cultivated lands and that kind of thing. But when we start out, and this is worth knowing, the Garden of Eden is very small. So that's worth knowing. Now we go to Genesis chapter 12. God's been dealing with anyone, anywhere who will deal with him. Now he's going to start working with one family. Now, why would God focus down like that? Well, because of the fall of man. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for right now. So because of the fall of Adam, then God knows he's got to send a Messiah, a sacrifice, a lamb, if you will, the Lamb of God, the Son of God. God knows his plan for redeeming mankind. He told people that in Genesis 3:15. He told Adam and Eve that there will be a person who will crush the adversary. God revealed that in different ways to different people. For example, we know from Genesis 22, when God told Abraham, he had told Abraham, in your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. In Genesis 22, God says, I want you to offer your son Isaac as a burnt offering. And of course, we learned from Hebrews that offering of Isaac was setting up a type of Christ. So this is Abraham. And what God is doing now is he can't bring the Messiah out of the world, so to speak. There's too many people. It's too big. Things are too crazy. There's too many people that are disobedient. So God focuses on one family, and that's the family of Abraham. And so now he's going to deal with Abraham as a family until the Exodus, when the family becomes a nation. And then God begins to deal with the nation. But let's take a look at Genesis chapter 12. And in Genesis chapter 12, verse 2, God says to Abraham, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and you will be a blessing. So God says, number one, you're going to be a great nation, meaning I'm going to multiply your seed. And verse 7, Yahweh appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your seed. And then it says, Abram built an altar there to Yahweh, who appeared to him. So at this point, God has said to Abram, I'm going to multiply your seed, and I'm going to give you the land. It's just something that God has said. Now, as his relationship with Abram develops, he's going to make that into a covenant. So if we go to Genesis chapter 15, and in Genesis chapter 15, verse 1, after these things, the word of Yahweh came to Abram in a vision, saying, don't be afraid, Abram. I'm your shield, your exceeding great reward. And verse 2 is one of those verses that it's a lot more technicolor if we understand the culture. By this time, Abraham is fairly old, and he doesn't have any children. And when you don't have children in that culture, you have no one to take care of you. When you get older, you have no one you can pass your things to. It's a tremendous curse to not have children. And Abraham and Sarah didn't have any children by this point, and Ishmael had not been born yet either. And so you've got to kind of understand that background to get what's going on here, because when God shows up, it's kind of funny because here's Abram, and he has no children, no one that's going to really genuinely support him in a pinch. God shows up and says, don't be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your exceeding great reward. And Abraham doesn't say, oh, thank goodness, I thought I was here all alone. Instead, he kind of goes, bah, what good is that? Abram in verse 2 says, Lord Yahweh, what will you give me, since I go childless? And he who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And that is kind of interesting, because remember, Damascus was a huge, thriving population center, and they had a lot of commerce there. Abraham's down in Israel. Damascus is, 70, 80, 100 miles north. It's hard to tell exactly where Abram is, but he's down in southern Israel. And he's basically got a friend and business partner way up north in Damascus. And he says, God says, I'm going to be your shield and your reward. And Abram's like, what are you going to give me? I'm childless. And the guy who's going to inherit my stuff isn't even a kid. It's Eliezer in Damascus. And verse 3, Abram says, behold, to me you've given no seed, no children. One born in my own house is my heir. And then verse 4, God speaks, the word of Yahweh came to him saying, this man will not be your heir, but he who will come out of your own body will be your heir. And Abraham believed that. And then verse 8, verse 7, God said to Abram, I am Yahweh who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to possess it. Verse 8, he said, Lord Yahweh, how will I know that I will possess it? Now remember, way back in Genesis 12, God had said, I'll give you the land. God had said that. But Abraham is pushing in here. He wants something a little firmer. How will I know that I will possess it? So God said, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Verse 10, so Abram brought all these, and he cut them down the middle and laid each half opposite the other, but he did not divide the birds. This was an old way of doing the blood covenant. Different ways of doing the blood covenant One was you'd take an animal and you'd cut it in half and you'd lay the halves apart. And then the two people making the covenant would walk down the middle between the dead animals. And so that's what's going on here. Now, if you'll notice, in just a minute, we'll get to Exodus chapter 24. God made a blood covenant with Israel. He didn't make it this way. When God made the blood covenant with Israel, as we will see, he had the animals killed. He had the blood caught in a bowl, and then the blood that would be on him was sprinkled on his altar, and the blood that was going to be on the people was sprinkled actually directly on the people. So the question then becomes, well, why didn't God do it the same both ways? The standard way is what he does in Exodus 24. Sprinkle the blood on him, sprinkle the blood on the people. Why not do that here? And the answer is going to be because God didn't want Abraham involved. You know, if you remember what happened with the old covenant, the blood was sprinkled on the people. They said they would obey God. They said they would follow his ways, but did they? No, they didn't. And God ended up divorcing Israel, and then God ended up sending Judah away too, and it was just a big, huge mess. So God, this is a really important covenant because it's the covenant, number one, for the people that are going to be the people of God, and number two, for the land of Israel, which God really wanted to make sure that eventually, as we know, the Messiah is going to rule that land. So what God did is he said, okay, you put these things like you're making a blood covenant. Verse 12, when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, terror and great darkness fell on him. And he said to Abraham, and I love this because Abraham's asleep. So it's not like he's exactly listening. But God said to Abram, you must know, yes, know that your offspring will live as foreigners in a land that's not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. I will also judge that nation whom they will serve. Afterwards, they will come out with great wealth, which is exactly what happened when Israel left Egypt. And you're going to die and be buried. 16 in the fourth generation, they'll come back to the land of Israel. Verse 17, when the sun went down, it was dark. Behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. So it's not just one thing. You know, you do want to have two things testify in any kind of agreement or covenant. So God came as both a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch. Later on, we can read in Hebrew that by two immutable things, God gave us the hope by both the oath and the promise. And it says that in Hebrews. So God passes through both as a torch and a smoking fire pot. Verse 18, on that day, Yahweh cut a covenant with Abraham, saying, I have given this land to your offspring from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. And then he talks about, you know, what the land is. And this is Genesis 15. In Genesis 17, God gives the sign of the covenant, which is circumcision. And then in Genesis 18, God comes back and Abraham and Sarah have a son, and that's Isaac. In this covenant for the land, God spoke this to Isaac as well in Genesis 26:3. We might as well take a quick look there. Let's go to Genesis chapter 26, verse 3. Again, this is to make this very solid for Israel, these promises. So now he's promised the land to Abraham. Here's Isaac, his son. In verse 3, well, verse 2, it says Yahweh appeared to him. God appeared to Isaac. In verse 3, and that's God appearing in human form, by the way. In verse 3, stay in this land and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and your seed I will give all these lands, and I will fulfill the oath that I swore to Abraham your father. And that was involved with that blood covenant. God saying, I will do what I said I will do. So this is to Isaac. And we see the same thing with Jacob. Let's go to Genesis 28. Now, there's a few of these with Jacob. God had to say things a few times to Jacob, it seems. So Genesis chapter 28 and verse 13, this is when, let's just pick up some context. Verse 10, Jacob went out from Beersheba and went toward Haran. Beersheba is in the far south of Israel. Haran is in southern Syria. Verse 11, he came to a certain place and spent the night there because the sun had set. He took one of the stones of the place and put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. Verse 12, and he dreamed, and behold, a stairway was sitting on the earth. That gets translated ladder in some versions, but it's not a ladder. It is a stairway. And behold, the stairway was sitting on the earth, and its top reached to heaven, and behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. Verse 13, behold, Yahweh stood above it. There at the top of the stairway stood God. And he said, I am Yahweh, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you're lying, to you I will give it and your seed. Now that becomes important. Why? Because Jacob's leaving the land. Jacob's just tricked his brother, and so he's running. And so as he's running, he's leaving the land. And as he's leaving, God appears to him and says, the land on which you're lying, to you I will give it. And of course, we know that Jacob did come back into the land with his 13 children. He had the 12 sons and a daughter named Dinah. And then verse 14, your seed will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. In you and in your seed, all the families of the earth will be blessed, which is a prophecy of the Messiah. And then verse 15, behold, I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go and will bring you again to this land, which took years and years, but God was finally good for that. And Jacob came back into the land. Well, when Jacob did come back into the land, he had his 12 sons. You guys know the story of Joseph, and Joseph was sold into slavery. So let's go to Exodus chapter 19. So it's while Israel is in Egypt that they become a nation. They were very tribal, but it was as they came out of Egypt and as they were in the wilderness wandering, that it was obvious that God was going to deal with them as a nation. And so God's relationship, if you will, with Israel changed at the time of the Exodus. So that we start right in verse 1 of Exodus chapter 19. It says, in the third month, after the children of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that same day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. The scholars argue about what the same day means. The general consensus is it's the first day of the month. So if it says the third month after the children had gone out of the land of Egypt, they left the land of Egypt, if you remember, on the 15th of the month. The 14th of the month is Passover, and they killed the Passover lamb. They put the blood on their doorposts, and that protected them from the death angel that smote the firstborn in Egypt. And at midnight, which was the next day, which was the 15th, Pharaoh sent for Moses and said, get your people and get out of Egypt. So they left on the 15th day of the first month. By the way, especially because they left at night and made their preparations and walked at night, remember that the 15th of the month, Israel goes by lunar months. They don't use a solar year. They use a lunar year of 354 days. So the 15th day of every month is a full moon. The first day of every month, there's no moon. It's black. But the 15th day of every month is a full moon. So that was very helpful when Israel was getting ready, making preparations, rounding things up, and leaving Egypt. There was a full moon to do that by. So this would say then the third month on the same day. If that's the first day of the month, then they walked from the 15th of Nisan to the end, the last day of Nisan, 29. So they walked for about 15 days. Then they walked through the whole second month. And then at the start of the third month, they arrive in Sinai, which tells us now they've been walking a month and a half. So they're walking a month and a half to get to Mount Sinai. And they came to the wilderness. They encamped in the wilderness. And it says Israel camped before the mountain, Mount Sinai. Verse 3, Moses went up Mount Sinai to God. And Yahweh called to him out of the mountain, saying, this is what you are to tell the house of Jacob and tell the children of Israel. You have seen what I did. By the way, this is what you are to tell the house of Jacob, the children of Israel. Remember that Israel is also the name of Jacob. His name was he was called Israel by the angel. So the house of Jacob and the children of Israel are two names for the same group. And again, they're being identified here. He's kind of pulling them into a national identity, but they're still the sons of Jacob. There's still a tribal aspect to them. And God says, you saw what I did in Egypt, verse 5. Now therefore, if you will listen, yes, listen to my voice and keep my covenant. Now he hasn't made a covenant yet, but he's talking about the covenant he's going to make with them. If you'll keep my covenant, then you will be my own possession from among all people. And that becomes very important, because if Israel, the nation, is God's own possession out of all the people on earth, then God wants to live among them. Thus, the tabernacle, the Mishkan, which is the dwelling place. And we'll see that. So he says, you'll be my own possession from among all people, for all the earth is mine. You will be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And now he's using words that he hasn't used of them before. You're going to be a kingdom. You're going to be a nation. So God here is projecting to them his plan for Israel to be a nation, and it's going to occupy the what we call the promised land, Israel. And he said, these are the words you are to speak to the children of Israel. Verse 7, Moses came. Now he was up on top of Mount Sinai. He comes down, calls for the elders of the people, set before them all these words that Yahweh had commanded him. Now, God hadn't said that much, but Moses says, okay, this is what God has said. And the people are like, you got to remember that it was just a month and a half ago that the people saw all the plagues on Egypt. So they had an idea that God was a power to deal with. He was certainly a very powerful God, and he had been the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, their ancestors. So the people are feeling like they know God, have a little bit of a relationship with God. So in verse 8, all the people answered together and said, all that Yahweh has spoken, we will do. And Moses reported the words of the people to Yahweh. And so then, starting in verse 9, Yahweh says, I'm going to come to you in a thick cloud. Now, this is, we really want to pay attention to this, because for the most part, the Christian world ignores it. Yahweh said to Moses, behold, I will come to you in a thick cloud so that the people can hear when I speak with you and can also believe you forever. So God's intention now was to come down on Mount Sinai and then speak the words of the law in a loud voice so that everyone could hear them. And we'll find out that's exactly the way the Ten Commandments were given. They were given by God in a loud voice. And he says, this is what I'm going to do. I want the people to hear when I speak with you and can believe you forever. And Moses told the words of the people to Yahweh. And so then Yahweh says, all right, go to the people, sanctify them today, tomorrow, that in other words, get them ready to meet with me. Verse 16, it came to pass on the third day when it was daybreak that there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain and the sound of a shofar, that's your ram's horn trumpet, that was exceedingly loud, and all the people in the camp trembled. Verse 17, Moses led the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the lower part of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai smoked all over, because Yahweh descended on it in fire. and its smoke went up like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. When the sound of the shofar grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him by a voice. And we have every reason to believe the people heard that. Moses spoke up toward the top of the mountain. God answered Moses. And then verse 20, Yahweh came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and he called Moses to the top of the mountain. Moses went up, and Yahweh said, go down and warn the people. And so now Moses is going to go down. Verse 23, Moses said, well, the people can't come up here. And Yahweh says, look, go down, and you are to bring Aaron up with you, but do not let the priests and people break through to come up to Yahweh, lest he break forth on them. Verse 25, so Moses went down to the people and told them. So Moses now goes down to the bottom and tells the people not to try to run up the mountain and see God. So now we have Exodus chapter 20. Then God spoke all these words, saying, I am Yahweh your God, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You must not have any other gods besides me. You must not make for yourself a carved image. Verse 7, you must not misuse the name of Yahweh. Verse 8, remember the Sabbath day. Verse 12, honor your mother and father. What's this? Well, this is the 10 Commandments. And where's Moses? He's down at the bottom of the mountain. Yeah, he's down at the bottom of the mountain. So God is shouting these words off of the top of the mountain. Did he write them on a tablet? Yes, but this is between this event. Moses is down with the people. God giving the law like this is between Moses' third and fourth time up. And it's only on his fifth time up that he's going to get the 10 Commandments. So here God shouts these words down, and it scares the people. Now remember, we read in Exodus 19, God said, I'm going to speak all my words to them so that they will hear and believe me. That was God's intention. He was going to speak the whole law to Israel. Did that happen? No, because after he'd spoken the 10 Commandments, then we read verse 18, all the people saw the thunderings, the lightnings, the sound of the shofar, the mountain smoking. When the people saw it, they trembled and stayed at a distance. In verse 19, they said to Moses, speak with us yourself and we will listen, but do not let God speak with us lest we die. So God's intention from Exodus 19 was to speak the whole law in a loud voice. The people got the 10 Commandments and said, that's enough. We don't want to hear God's voice anymore. And, if there's a kind of a mini lesson in this, it's intriguing that people pray to know God better. People pray for a relationship with God. But, an intimate relationship with God is very intense. And here these people are, and they're like, yeah, okay, God's gonna speak his words, his law to us. And then when he actually starts to do it, they're like, well, nah, Moses, I'll tell you what, you go up and you talk to God, you come down and bring us the law. Now, this thing about God shouting the 10 Commandments off of the mountain, it's astounding to me that this is not better known in Christianity. Because not only is it talked about in Exodus chapter 19 and then done in Exodus chapter 20, but it shows up in a whole bunch of places. You can keep a ribbon or whatever you've got here. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 4. I want to show you that this pops up in quite a few places in the scripture. I'm going to read just a few of them, but there's more than I can read, but you can find it in the REV commentary too. So in Deuteronomy 4:10, first of all, what we're doing is we're going forward 40 years. In Exodus chapter 19 and 20, they had been wilderness wandering for a month and a half. By the time we get to Deuteronomy, they're in the last 60 days of the whole 40 years. So we go from the very beginning of the Exodus wanderings to the very end of the Exodus wanderings. And what's going on in Deuteronomy now is a recap of some of the things that have happened. So in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 10, Moses is speaking to the Israelites. He says, remember the day that you stood before Yahweh your God in Horeb, when Yahweh said to me, assemble the people before me, and I will make them hear my words, that they may learn to fear me all the days that they live on earth, and that they may teach their children. Verse 11, you came near and stood at the foot of the mountain. The mountain burned with fire to the heart of heaven, along with darkness, cloud, and thick darkness. And Yahweh spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of the words, but you saw no form. You only heard a voice. He declared to you his covenant that he commanded you to perform, even the 10 commandments. And he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone, which came later. So it's pretty clear here again that God is speaking these words out loud. Let's skip down real quick to verse 36 in this chapter. Or Deuteronomy 4:36. Out of heaven, he made you to hear his voice so that he might instruct you. And here on earth, he made you to see his great fire, and you heard his words out of the midst of the fire. So again, another clear verse. Let's go to chapter 5. Next chapter over, Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 4. Yahweh spoke with you face to face on the mountain out of the midst of the fire. I stood between Yahweh and you at that time to show you the words of Yahweh, because you were afraid because of the fire and did not go up onto the mountain. And then it goes and it repeats the 10 commandments. And I'd like to go to Hebrews, please. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 12. Because this speaking the words in a loud voice comes up in the book of Hebrews as well. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 18. And what the author is doing here is talking about the viability, if you will, of the covenant. And he says, verse 18, for you have not come to what can be touched, meaning the mountain, that burned with fire, and to blackness and darkness and storm, and the sound of a trumpet, and the voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further word should be spoken to them. For they could not bear what was commanded. If even an animal touches the mountain, it will be stoned. And so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I am terrified and trembling. And then verse 22, on the contrary, you have come to Mount Zion, that is, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and that kind of thing. So what he's doing here is he's comparing the Old Testament and how that covenant was made and the New Testament. So let's go back to Exodus chapter 20. And in Exodus chapter 20, the people say, Moses, you go and speak to God, and we'll listen. So Moses does. Verse 22, Yahweh says to Moses, this is what you are to tell the children of Israel. Now, this is Exodus chapter 20. So then we have Exodus chapter 21, and these are laws that God gave to Moses because the people didn't want to hear them directly. So now we have the law of Moses, if you will, in Exodus chapter 20, the 10 commandments. In Exodus chapter 21, we have more commandments. He starts out laws about slaves and slavery, then laws about personal injury, and then chapter 22, laws about theft, laws about crop protection, laws about personal property, laws about seduction, capital offenses, laws protecting the vulnerable, Exodus chapter 23, laws about honesty and justice, laws about the Sabbath and the feasts, and then promises and warnings about keeping the law. So what you have now is 4 chapters, Exodus chapter 20, 21, 22, 23, and these are all the laws and regulations that God is giving Israel. The first 10 commandments, he shouted down directly to Israel. The rest of these chapters, he gave to Moses. So now we go to Exodus chapter 24. So in Exodus chapter 24, Yahweh said to Moses, come up to Yahweh, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and bow down and worship from a distance. Moses alone, however, is to come near to Yahweh. But they are not to come near, nor are the people to go up Mount Sinai with him. So verse 3, now Moses is up on the mountain getting these laws. Verse 3, so Moses went down and told the people all the words of Yahweh and all the ordinances. Now, what are all the words of Yahweh and all the ordinances? Exodus 20, 21, 22, and 23. So those are the laws and the ordinances that Moses has been given by God. And all the people answered with one voice, meaning they were all in agreement that all the words that Yahweh has spoken, we will do. Now, that's pretty interesting because you and I know the history of Israel. These guys say, we'll keep all the words of Yahweh, we'll obey. And we all know they didn't obey. They didn't obey for very long at all. But in any case, verse 4, Moses wrote all the words of Yahweh. So the reason we have Exodus 20, 21, 22, 23 is because Moses wrote them down. And he rose up early in the morning and he built an altar under the mountain, or we would call it at the base of the mountain, and 12 standing stones for the 12 tribes of Israel. He sent young men of the children of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of young bulls to Yahweh. And when you offered those offerings, he offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. And when he offered those offerings, then there's a lot of blood. And the priests caught that blood in basins. And that's why in verse 6 it says, and Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. And God is represented as the altar that's going to accept the blood and accept the sacrifices and that kind of thing from the children of Israel. So the altar here represents God. So now Moses has killed animals. He's caught the blood. He takes half of the blood and he sprinkles it on the altar, verse 6. Verse 7, before he moves on, verse 7, he takes, now it's called the book of the covenant, or translated the scroll of the covenant. Well, what is the book of the covenant or the scroll of the covenant? It's Exodus 20, 21, 22, 23. That's the book of the covenant, all those laws. Moses wants to make sure that he and the people are clear. So he already sprinkled the blood on the altar because he knows God's clear. In verse 7, he takes the book of the covenant, he reads it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that Yahweh has spoken, we will do and be obedient. Verse 8, Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, look, this is the blood of the covenant that Yahweh made with you concerning all these words. And this is the old covenant. What you and I know is the old covenant. This is it. It's the blood covenant made between Israel and God here on Mount Sinai. And you can imagine that this had some form of lasting impact. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've never really had anybody sprinkle blood on me. But I think if I had, it would be something that I would remember for a while. And so, they entered this blood covenant. God's got blood thrown on his altar. The people have blood sprinkled on them. And now their job is to obey God. Well, we know the record. We know what happens. What happens is Moses, goes away now for 40 days and 40 nights. And are the people obedient to God while Moses is gone 40 days and 40 nights? No. The blood on their clothes is barely dried. Moses goes away and they make a golden calf and start worshiping it. So much for a commitment to obey. So they get into idolatry. By the way, you may have heard it said, it's sometimes commonly taught, Moses went up on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights to get the 10 commandments. I don't know if you've ever heard that before. Moses went up on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights to get the 10 commandments. No, he didn't. He already had the 10 commandments. God spoke them from the top of the mountain, and they were written down in the book of the covenant before Moses ever left. So then why did Moses go away for 40 days and 40 nights? He needed to get the details of the tabernacle. He had to get the details of the tent that God would dwell in. So that's why he was gone for 40 days and 40 nights. And we can see this now in chapter 25, because in verse 24, the very last verse, verse 24, chapter 24, verse 18, which is the very last verse, it says, Moses entered into the middle of the cloud and went up on the mountain. And Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. And now what happens on the mountain? And verse 1, Yahweh spoke to Moses saying, speak to the children of Israel that they take an offering for me. So now what's going to happen is God's going to spend 7 chapters giving Moses details about the tabernacle. And one of the things we know from reading 7 chapters of detail is it's not enough. There's not enough detail in the tabernacle to actually construct one with accuracy. There are important pieces left out that we don't know. We can get close, and you've probably seen models and stuff like that. We can get close, but we don't actually know certain things about the tabernacle and how to put it together. So the first thing he does in chapter 25 is he covers the fact that you're going to need this offering to build the tabernacle. Verse 3, you're going to need and take from them gold, silver, bronze. Verse 4, blue, purple, scarlet, fine linen, goat's hair. Verse 5, ram skin dyed red, the skin of dugongs, acacia wood, oil for the light, spices for the anointing oil, and for the sweet incense, onyx stones, stones to be mounted on the ephod and on the breastplate. Those are clothing of the high priest. By the way, a dugong is the manatee of the Red Sea. So it's kind of like the Indian elephant and the African elephant. They're both elephants and they look sort of the same, but they're sort of different. And the manatee that we deal with down in Florida, and I live on a little river, and we have manatee go up and down our little river. So I see them with some regularity. But if you go to their cousins who live in the Red Sea, they're called dugongs. They look kind of the same, like a floating baked potato, but they're in the Red Sea. So that's what a dugong is. It would make a perfect outer skin since they live in the water. And verse 8, and this is important then, because now God has covenanted the nation of Israel. Remember Exodus 19, out of all the nations on the earth, Israel is going to be his people, and they all live in tents. So he says, verse 8, they are to make a holy place for me, and I will dwell among them. So God now says, I want you to build a holy place for me to live, so I can live among you. Verse 9, according to all that I show you, the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all its furniture, you are to make it just like that pattern. And the tabernacle, the word tabernacle in Hebrew, mishkan, means dwelling or dwelling place. And it's a little confusing to call it a tabernacle, because I thought tabernacle was just a fancy word for a tent. And actually it sort of is. The tabernacle is a fancy word for the tent. But this is not, it is a tent, but tabernacle doesn't mean tent. Tabernacle means dwelling place. And why does God need a dwelling place? Because now he said, I've covenanted with you to be my people. Out of all the nations on the earth, you are going to be my people. So I want to live among you. So if I'm going to live among you, then you've got to build me a tabernacle. And that's what's going on here. And then, then we read all the stuff, like he starts out with the ark. Now, interestingly enough, in chapter 25, he's got the offerings to build the tabernacle. Why would he start with the ark of the covenant? What's the point about starting with the ark? Why would he do that? Because what does the ark contain? The tablets with the 10 commandments. And the 10 commandments are the heart of the covenant that God made with Israel. If there's no covenant between God and Israel, then there's no need for him to dwell among them. There's no contract covenant that they're going to obey him and he's going to be their God. So the whole reason for the dwelling, if you will, the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, the dwelling place, the whole reason for that is because of the covenant. So if there's no covenant, he doesn't need to have a dwelling place among them. So therefore, the most important thing in the dwelling place is the Ark of the Covenant that contains the 10 commandments that then are the agreement that sets up the relationship between God and Israel. And that's why in going through and now starting in the next, like I say, the next 7 chapters are details about how to build the dwelling place of God and all of the things about it. So that, and if we understand that, then basically what's going to happen is the tabernacle is going to go and move around where God is for the 40 years. And then remember that Deuteronomy, I said, was in the last 2 months of the wilderness wanderings. And in Deuteronomy, there's a tidal shift. And if you're reading the REV, if you do a phrase search, or not a phrase search, but a Boolean search with 2 words, and that's place and choose. Israel was able to worship basically anywhere God took them. But all of a sudden, and you'll see that in Deuteronomy, God starts telling them, okay, it's not good enough anymore that you worship wherever you are. Now I want you to worship in the place that I choose. That's where you can legitimately worship. It starts in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 5, but to the place that Yahweh your God will choose out of all your tribes to put his name there, even to his habitation you must seek, and there you must come. Deuteronomy 12:11, a few verses later, to the place that Yahweh your God will choose to cause his name to live there. It is there you are to bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings and your sacrifices. And if you just do a quick search on place and choose, you'll see all this. So it's very interesting that Abraham, he could build an altar anywhere he wanted. You know, Isaac, they went down to Egypt. People were building an altar anywhere they wanted. In the wilderness, they're wandering around. They're building. They're moving the tabernacle around, that kind of thing. And God says, by the way, when we get into the land, don't think you can worship wherever you are. In the place that I choose, then that's where you're going to be able to worship. And what is God doing here? He's kind of refining Israel and pointing them in a direction. So we started out with the fall of Adam, and then for 2,000 years, basically, between Adam and Abraham, God was happy to have anybody worship him, and he kind of, as long as they were worshiping him, he was kind of happy. Then starting 2,000 years before Christ, he's like, okay, now I'm going to work with this one family, and they're going to be the holy family. I'm going to call Messiah out of their seed. Then by 430 years later at the Exodus, then he's calling Israel, and he makes them a nation, and he makes them a kingdom. And he says, okay, I'm going to work with you guys. By the time he's worked with them, now Moses is coming to the end of his life. He's going to say, I want you to worship me where I choose. And then that goes through the Old Testament until the time of Christ. Then we have the age of grace. And in the age of grace, there's a pressure on the personal relationship that we have with God. That we walk, we talk with God. We have Christ in us, the hope of glory. We don't have a temple we have to worship with, but we worship in spirit and in truth. And then after the rapture, God reestablishes a temple, but God is going to be personally present in that temple and in the person of the Messiah. And so people are going to go to that temple because that's where the Messiah is. That's where God's going to be. And then finally, after the millennial kingdom. In the eternal kingdom, we're back where God is there in person, just like he was in the Garden of Eden, and God's plan that he originally established for man. God coming in person and people having that personal one-on-one relationship with God is reestablished in the eternal kingdom. When God is there in person, we are there, and everybody can see God and fellowship with him. So it's this kind of God moving through history to get us closer and closer to the goal that he wanted. But this thing about having a tabernacle is very interesting, because when he finally chose a nation, and that nation covenanted with him, he would be their God, they would obey his rules. Then he said, okay, I want to come and dwell among you. And so he had them build the dwelling place, the tabernacle. And if we understand that, the whole process becomes a little clearer, rather than just thinking of it as it's called the tabernacle, and I think it means tent. That's not really what it means. So thank you for being with me tonight. It's been a blessing to continue to clarify this, even in my own life and walk, and I trust it's been a blessing to you.